Hello guys, it's me, Greed here. Today, I want to talk about the DPS passive in Overwatch, and I'm going to start with the negatives, and then later on in the video I might touch on some positive aspects of it, but my overall opinion of the DPS passive is that I personally don't like it. I don't think it's good for the game, I don't think it's particularly healthy, and I don't think it solves more problems than it creates. Now obviously Overwatch can't be a perfect game, you have to compromise at some parts. You have to say, well, this system isn't perfect, but perhaps it fixes a couple of big issues and might implement a couple of small issues, but the DPS passive is not one of those. I would consider the healing passive to be one of those. I personally am not a huge fan of the global healing passive, but I do agree that it solves more bigger issues than it creates. Therefore, it's generally speaking a net positive for the game, unlike the DPS passive. My first complaint with the DPS passive, and I think one that's the easiest to fix in my opinion, though it may create more bloat, is that there's no actual indicator that it's affecting someone. There's no way for you to look at a target and know if the DPS passive is applied on them. You either have to manually see your DPS actively shooting a target and be able to track how long the passive is applied to that hero, or you just kind of have to guess, and I don't really think that's a very good system for it. Now obviously, the argument against adding some kind of indicator would be the skill argument of better players are just going to be able to know these things and it's a skill gap, and also it might add more visual clutter to the game, which already is quite a hot topic considering the fact there are so many abilities in the game that kind of make seeing a little bit difficult right now. It's obviously not the worst it's ever been, it's a lot better, but it's also not as good as it could be. Something important to note is the DPS passive is actually different in 5v5 and 6v6. In 5v5, it's a flat 30% healing reduction on targets affected by the DPS passive, and it's 15% for tanks in 5v5. But for 6v6, it is a flat 15% reduction, I believe. I don't think the tanks get a benefit. So keep in mind that the numbers I'm going to be talking about are specific to 6v6 because it's the superior format in every way. And if you disagree, you're simply wrong and a stupid, stinky boy. So, one of the problems with the DPS passive is it affects tank efficacy in terms of their damage output. Now that isn't necessarily a bad thing because the tanks are kind of broken, but assuming we had a perfect world where the balance was even generally a little bit okay, it can end up affecting tanks in a way that I don't think is really all that healthy, especially some specific tanks. So, for example, if a tank is going aggressive on a certain character, like let's say a Winston is going aggressive, the difference between a character having the DPS passive on them and not having the DPS passive on them is absolutely gigantic, because Winston does 70 damage per second. Let's assume the target he's going after is being healed by a Mercy, who does 60 healing per second. In this scenario, that they do not have the DPS passive applied to them, Winston is only doing 10 damage per second to that target. And if you include reload times, I don't believe Winston actually can physically kill any target being killed or being healed by a Mercy. However, if you apply the DPS passive to the target that Winston is hunting, it actually doubles his damage output to 19 instead of 10, which obviously isn't a lot of damage, but a double is still double, no matter how you look at it, which is a big deal. Now obviously, that's just accounting for Winston. How does it affect other tanks? So let's look at Hog, for example. Hog is a tank that actually doesn't really care about the existence of the DPS passive or not, because he does not solely rely on it for his ability to actually kill a target. Because his damage output is extremely bursty, it's irrelevant what the DPS passive is doing, because the chances are he's going to burn through their entire health bar regardless, and it doesn't matter if they're being healed or not, because he can burst them down fast enough. He'll just hook a target, blow them up with pigpen and left click, and there actually isn't enough time for there to be any healing applied to the target anyway, therefore the passive is irrelevant to him. But it completely mutilates a character like Winston's ability to actually go in the backline, because if the DPS passive isn't applied to a certain target, like I said, that cuts his damage in half, assuming he's being healed by a Mercy. And Mercy outputs relatively middle of the pack levels of healing, though Mercy is a single target healer. Imagine that Winston is going after a target that's being healed by an Alari, or a Pylon, or a BAP or something. That makes things a much bigger deal. Or if he's hunting a target with armor, it changes so much about the character, and I think overall, the DPS passive inconsistently affecting different tank heroes and support characters overall is not good for the game, because you can lose out on a lot of solo playability purely because maybe your DPS didn't apply the passive onto the target at the right time, or maybe they got hit with a Zarya bubble or a Kiriko cleanse at the right time that actually cleared the passive off them, and that's the difference between you killing a guy and not killing a guy, even if you play well. It comes down to your DPS needing to apply that passive for you in order to get value that you simply cannot get yourself because you don't have the ability to apply the passive. Now, this obviously affects more aggressive tanks than it does more passive tanks. For example, a tank like Reinhardt or Junker Queen or like Winston kind of rely on their ability to get their value while they're committed. Unlike more passive tanks like a Ramatra or a Sigma, where the DPS passive is less relevant to them because they are incurring less risk from their natural gameplay loop. Their pressure cycle is naturally safer, therefore they have less of a reliance on the DPS passive because they don't need to get their value as quickly as more aggressive tanks do. Meaning, the difference between a Junker Queen getting value and a Sigma getting value can literally come down to where the DPS passive was applied and when. For a Sigma, it's not that big of a deal because he's just going to be poking anyway, and if he gets someone, he gets someone, if he doesn't, he doesn't. But for Queen, it's the difference between her killing a target and getting traded out, her killing a target that she's 1v1ing and then staying alive for it, or just simply not being able to kill a target fast enough because they're getting healed. Therefore, it disproportionately affects the tank characters in a negative way, making it so that gameplay becomes more passive overall because it negatively affects aggressive tanks more than it does passive tanks. Now, the DPS passive can actually lead to more bloated healing numbers overall, especially when it comes to AoE healing. Because of a character, say like Baptiste, because of the DPS passive, it may be the case that he's not able to actually heal up a single target through the DPS passive, even though his natural healing output is AoE. Therefore, they might need to buff his overall healing output in order to contend with the fact that the DPS passive is the way it is, therefore making his overall healing extremely efficient because it's able to target multiple people at the same time, but it may have required a buff because it simply wasn't good enough to keep one target alive through the DPS passive alone, which makes sustain and overall AoE healing infinitely more valuable because the fact that it is naturally going to be lower because it can affect multiple targets. Therefore, if they were going to buff these supports up to the level where they were actually able to keep a single target alive, they would also be massively increasing the ability for them to sustain the entire team overall, which again is not healthy. Now, it comes down to, in my personal opinion, one of the biggest issues with the DPS passive, and it's the application process of it. In order to actually get the DPS passive onto someone, you as a DPS need to apply damage to that character. Now, that sounds obviously relatively simple, but think of how it affects the different characters. For Tracer, it's easy. You're just bullet hosing shots absolutely everywhere, and if one of them tags someone, the DPS passive is applied to them. But then you think of a character like Hanzo, and it becomes infinitely harder for that character to consistently land shots, therefore this DPS passive uptime is going to be naturally lower than those characters. Therefore, a character like Hanzo becomes massively weaker overall because he's not as good as applying the DPS passive. So even though Hanzo is in a bad spot right now, we could assume that he was strong, he would be naturally worse than a lot of other characters even if he was good because of his inability to apply the DPS passive, which is so strong even in any state. Even with it being only 15%, it's still such a large decrease in healing that his natural inconsistency in the way he applies it is going to make him weaker overall, regardless of his actual hero strength. Now it comes down to ammo efficiency. This one is a really big deal because it changes the amount of actual bullets, or really just ammo, required to kill a target depending on who you are and what healing they are. There are a lot of characters in this game where you just simply do not have enough ammo if you maintain a relatively average level of accuracy to cut through the amount of healing a target may receive if they do or don't have the DPS passive on them. If they do have the DPS passive on them, your ammo is extremely efficient because overall it's technically cutting through the same percentage of health, but they are able to regain a smaller portion of that over time from their supports. However, if you do not have the DPS passive applied to the target that you're attacking, your ammo efficiency drops rapidly because it means that the target that you're going for is receiving healing at a much faster rate. Therefore, it takes longer overall because they're receiving healing at the same rate that you're putting out damage, meaning that you're going to have less uptime overall because you're going to have to reload more to cut through their healing. Therefore, your ammo is less efficient, and this affects a lot of targets. For example, Zarya. The DPS passive existence or non-existent can be the difference between a right-click killing a target and the right-click not killing a target, which means you have to go through a big reload animation, your charge is going to further decay, you're going to be doing less damage over time, and the longer a duel goes on for, you obviously become weaker because of your charge decay and other things. And this obviously applies to a lot of different characters, but it affects Zarya a lot because of the fact that your ammo management on Zarya is so important. Obviously, it's important on basically every character in the game, but it's especially important on Zarya because of the way you weave your right clicks in between your beam. And if you have to end up right clicking someone when you didn't need to, that lowers your beam uptime, which means therefore you technically can't cut through a health bar as efficiently, which is a big deal for a Zarya player. Therefore, if you do have a Zarya player on your team and you're a DPS, it's really important that you prioritize the targets she wants to go for because you increase her ammo efficiency massively. She becomes infinitely more efficient in the damage department if she has the passive applied to her, but she becomes substantially weaker if the passive isn't applied properly onto her target. Now, it's important that I talk about some of the positive aspects of the DPS passive. Now, I don't think any of these are actually good enough justification for the existence of the passive in the first place, but it is important that I touch on the things that are actually good about it. The first thing is it gives DPS a naturally superior dueling advantage when they're fighting targets. Because they're the ones that are able to apply the DPS passive, if they're going to be off dueling someone like a Tracer or a Genji or a Soldier, whoever it may be, they're always going to be playing the DPS passive. So no matter what scenario they're in, they're naturally going to be gaining an advantage against their dueling target because, for example, let's say they're dueling a support, they're able to apply the DPS passive to that support, but the support isn't able to apply it to that DPS. Therefore, if, for example, that DPS is a pocket and the support is a pocket, the DPS is naturally going to have a bigger advantage in that duel because of the application of the DPS passive, which I think is overall good for the game. Now, Ralph disagrees with this. He thinks that every character in the game should naturally have some kind of 50-50 duel potential. I believe that he doesn't believe that they should all have 50-50 duel potential in the sense that they're able to kill each other 50-50, more so that maybe a tank is able to out mitigate the damage and survive the 50-50, or gain more value through the 50-50 even though no kills happen, or a support is able to sustain themselves through a duel long enough to get more or less value out of it regardless of who dies. Maybe that's his point, I don't know entirely. That would make the most sense to me, because it would be a little strange if the argument was that he believes tanks or supports should have a 50-50 chance of killing a DPS target, assuming that the DPS target has gotten them in a 1v1. I would disagree with that, though that might not be what he's saying. Another benefit of the passive is that it helps to cut through a lot of the sustain that I had mentioned was in the game. Now, obviously, a lot of the sustain is in the game partly because of the passive, where a lot of supports have gotten buffed because of the existence of the passive in the first place. However, assuming that Season 9 stays in the game forever, the DPS passive stays in the game forever, then it is technically a benefit to the game that the DPS passive exists in some degree, because it is able to cut through a lot of the sustain in the game. If there wasn't a DPS passive, the healing numbers would be way too high. Now, obviously, I don't believe the best solution to the healing numbers being high is to say add the DPS passive. The best way would be simply balance the supports a little bit better and lower their actual healing numbers to something a bit more realistic. But assuming that they never did that, and Season 9 stayed and the DPS passive stayed, it would technically be overall a positive for the game, because the DPS would then be able to actually cut through a lot of the sustain, which I think is a big deal, because the sustain right now is a lot and it is very annoying. Is it overall a big enough positive to justify all the negatives? Absolutely not, but a positive is a positive no matter how you slice it. Anyway, that was me talking about the DPS passive. I tried to format this video a little differently because I know I can be a little incoherent, a little rambly. I'm a little silly, goofy guy. What can I say? I'm a little quirky. I'm a little silly, goofy guy. Teehee, you know what I'm saying? So I did bullet points. Maybe I'll do this for every video upcoming because I actually quite liked the pace of it. It felt easier to follow, especially just listening to myself talk. And you're obviously in the part right now where there's no bullet point, so it's incoherent rambling and it's not making any sense anymore. So you can see how quickly I get derailed when I don't have a guide to follow. But I probably should end up following a guide for future videos, because I realize watching back, like Ralph watching my videos, I can find myself getting lost in my own points sometimes, and sometimes I don't clarify things well, and it ends up making a point not sound like how I meant it. There's a lot of videos where I watch Ralph react to one of my videos, and he will watch something, he'll listen to what I say, I'll describe it poorly, and he ends up thinking I'm saying something that I'm not, and then we end up disagreeing when in reality we do agree. So I think this format created less ambiguity in the things I'm saying and increased the clarity, so it was a little more obvious. I also thought I was a bit more fair with this topic. Usually I can be a bit of a child sometimes, where I'm like, I'm objectively correct and you're wrong because I know what I'm talking about, and if you disagree, you're silly and you're dumb. And sometimes I don't attack a point objectively and I attack it through emotion, which isn't a very obviously good way to do anything. That's obviously not an excuse. I should be more smart with the way I talk about things. I've been doing this for a while, and I am an adult and I should be able to communicate like one. But yeah, sometimes I let my emotions get a little bit too strong and I end up being a bit of an asshole with the way I explain stuff, and I'm trying to get better at that, and I hope this video is an improvement. You know, I can only get, as long as I get like 0.5% better every day, then that's 0.5% better than I was yesterday, and to me that's a big improvement, and I'm happy with that. So I hope this video was good, I hope it was clear, I hope you enjoyed it, I love you all, I hope you all have a very good day, eat a hot meal, enjoy time with your family, I love you. Goodbye. 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 Have a good day. Goodbye. 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 Goodbye.